Evelyn stepped onto the plane with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her place among the elite. Yet from the moment she crossed the threshold, something fell off. Subtle glances, cold shoulders, whispered judgments that sliced through the luxury like a silent storm. She was a young black woman, perfectly poised but unmistakably out of place in the eyes of those around her, treated not as a valued passenger, but as an unwelcome anomaly. What followed was not just a flight, but a journey through layers of invisible barriers and orchestrated exclusion, a story of resilience tested at 35,000 feet. And just when it seemed the ordeal would end in defeat, a single revelation would shift everything, turning the tables on those who sought to erase her. If you're drawn to stories that expose hidden truths and challenge injustice, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? Your voice matters as we unravel this powerful tale together. It had started well. The early morning sunlight glinted off the windows of Gate A14, casting neat reflections on the polished floor. Evelyn Rhett, 13 years old, stood quietly in line, boarding pass in hand, dressed in a tailored charcoal blazer and black slacks, her shoes polished, her backpack sleek and light. She moved alone, with the calm self-control of someone trained to never stand out. First-class boarding was called, and the crowd ahead began moving forward, calm, affluent, and mostly white. Evelyn stepped into the stream, eyes ahead, shoulders back, repeating the mantra her father taught her: walk like you belong. 1 foot over the carpeted jet bridge threshold, and the first sting arrived. A couple turned to glance at her, the woman's lips pressing into a line, then whispering to her partner with a sideways nod in Ava's direction. The man laughed quietly. Evelyn looked down. Keep walking. When she reached the jet door, Marla Cray was standing tall in her immaculate navy uniform, platinum bob sharp and calculated, smile perfectly deployed for the older businessman just ahead. Welcome aboard, Mr. Delancey, Marla said with practiced ease, then shifted her weight and narrowed her eyes at Evelyn. The smile disappeared like a switch being flipped. Her eyes dropped to Ava's boarding pass. Can I see that, please? She asked, voice clipped, tone implying more suspicion than service. Ava extended the pass. Marla took it, scanned it, then tilted her head. This is for first. Ava nodded once. Marla's lips curled ever so slightly. Follow me, she said. But she didn't move. Instead, she gestured toward a side table just inside the galley and said, "We're doing a quick spot check. Step over here." Confused but obedient, Ava did as told. Marla opened the side drawer and pulled out latex gloves. Shoes off. Bag open, she said flatly. Ava hesitated, looking toward the line of boarding passengers now slowing behind her. Is something wrong? She asked quietly. Marla ignored the question. Just procedure. You understand. Her words were sugary, her tone anything but. As Ava slipped off her shoes and opened her backpack, a white woman with a small poodle in her arms passed by, smiling warmly. The dog barked twice, sharp and territorial. Marla turned to the woman, cooed, "So sorry about that," then looked back at Ava. "Try not to spook pets in the cabin. We have to keep the animals calm," she said, a touch louder than necessary. The passengers behind them now shifted uncomfortably. A man with graying temples and a tailored coat rolled his eyes and muttered something under his breath. Ava's face burned. After a minute of rifling through her pencil case, backup charger, and a novel she hadn't started yet, Marla finally stood upright and handed the bag back. "You can proceed," she said curtly. No apology, no smile, nothing. Ava slipped on her shoes and walked down the aisle of first class, as if she were being watched. And she was. Several pairs of eyes tracked her. One woman even adjusted her handbag on the aisle side as Ava passed, creating more space or less shared air. She arrived at 2A, window seat. She stepped in, placed her bag beneath the seat in a precise motion, and sat upright. Her knees were locked, back stiff. The man in 2B gave her one lingering glance, then turned back to his phone. She exhaled slowly. The plane smelled of leather and citrus. Her seat cushion was warm. For 3 seconds, she let herself believe that was the worst of it. From her peripheral vision, She watched Marla Cray move up and down the aisle like a specter of authority, her perfect stride echoing with sharp intent on the plush flooring. When she passed Ava's row again, there was no tray, no smile, no glance, just a clipboard in hand and a subtle glance down, followed by a short scribble on the page. It wasn't a service log. It looked personal, intentional. As the plane lifted off, a sense of weightlessness spread through the cabin, but not through Ava. For her, the air only grew thicker. The older man next to her, still engaged in his tablet, angled himself slightly away, creating just enough distance to communicate disinterest without saying a word. The couple across the aisle had begun flipping through their in-flight menus, though the woman kept glancing over the top edge. Her lips pursed, her mind visibly busy calculating how Ava had ended up in this space she clearly didn't belong to. Marla appeared again, and this time she wasn't holding anything. She crouched slightly beside Ava's seat, leaned toward the man in 2B, and whispered something just low enough that Ava couldn't hear the words, but could clearly detect the rhythm of warning in her tone. The man nodded once without looking up, his fingers still swiping across the screen. Marla stood, turned toward Ava with a neutral expression, and walked away without acknowledging her presence. 15 minutes later, a new cart came down the aisle, this time not for drinks, but for passenger comfort items, as they were referred to by the attendants. A younger woman, maybe in her 20s, moved alongside Marla, handing out small navy pouches embroidered with the airline's gold crest. Socks, lip balm, eye mask, earplugs, the tiny tokens that made luxury feel personal. Row after row received their pouch with a courteous nod, each interaction brief but warm. When they reached Ava's row, Marla took over. She handed one to 2B. She skipped Ava entirely. Her hand never paused near Ava's tray table. Not even a glance. Ava waited a beat, then two, thinking maybe it was a mistake. Then she turned slightly, her voice quiet but clear enough. "Excuse me, may I have one too?" Marla didn't stop walking. The young attendant behind her hesitated, reached toward the cart to grab a pouch, but Marla turned slightly and murmured something over her shoulder. The girl's hand froze. She looked down. Then she moved past. That silence hit harder than any insult. Ava sat back, eyes burning. She wasn't being overlooked. She was being deliberately denied, disregarded, tagged. She pulled her arms inward, wrapping them around herself slightly, not for warmth, but to keep herself from fraying at the edges. Minutes passed. Someone 2 rows ahead pressed the call button. Marla answered immediately, bending down to adjust a blanket, laughing softly at something the passenger said. Another bell chimed. Someone wanted water. Immediate service. But when Ava pressed the button on her own armrest, nothing happened. 5 minutes passed. 10. Finally, the light above her flicked off, but no one came. It hadn't been answered. It had been silenced. She looked toward the back of the cabin, where the curtains separating first class from the rest of the plane remained half closed. For a moment, she considered walking back, asking someone else. But the thought of standing, of walking that aisle under all those eyes, it locked her in place. She remained seated, still, silent, forgotten. Then came the yellow slip, folded into thirds, plain, blank on the outside. Marla returned once more, this time not looking at Ava, but depositing the slip onto her tray table as if delivering paperwork to a colleague. No words, no expression. Ava picked up slowly and unfolded it. A pre-printed note. Reminder: noise disturbances and excessive movement are discouraged in premium cabins. Please remain mindful of your surroundings. No signature. No indication of what she had supposedly done. She had not moved. She had not spoken. She had barely even blinked. And still, she was being punished in increments. Not with raised voices or outright confrontation, but through expertly designed acts of exclusion that isolated her further with every passing minute. The yellow slip had been taken, yes, but its damage lingered. She could still feel the weight of it, like a label branded on her presence, invisible to the eye, but sharp enough to change how others looked at her. Meal service began with ceremony. Flight attendants glided down the aisle like synchronized dancers, trays balanced. napkins folded in precise triangles, menus offered with a warm smile that never once turned Ava's way. Marla Cray returned at the front of the service line, walking with the elegance of someone who'd made this aisle her kingdom. Her expression was as unreadable as a marble bust, her uniform untouched by wrinkle or lint, her demeanor cool and distant, until she reached row 2. She handed the leather-bound menu to the man in 2B, bending just slightly to whisper the chef's recommendation. She lingered, laughed at his dry joke, then stood tall and turned to Ava without turning at all, simply bypassing her completely, as if the seat were unoccupied. The menu was not offered. The choice was not given. The ceremony skipped over her like a glitch in a performance. Another attendant, one Ava hadn't seen before, approached Ava's row several minutes later with a serving cart. On it were porcelain plates, polished silverware, artisan bread wrapped in linen. The woman stopped at 2B, delivered his meal with a flourish, then pulled a small foil-covered tray from the bottom of the cart and set it in front of Ava. The tray wasn't porcelain. It wasn't accompanied by silverware. It didn't even include a beverage. Just a lukewarm plastic container with an unmarked label, a spork, and a single packet of salt. Ava peeled back the foil slowly, not because she was eager to eat, but because every person near her was watching. Inside was a plain ham sandwich, white bread, thin meat, no garnish, and a bruised banana. No dressing, no options, no explanation. The woman placing the tray gave a tight nod and rolled the cart onward. Ava wanted to ask if there had been a mistake, if maybe she'd been given the wrong meal, but her mouth wouldn't form the words. She looked around and saw the difference immediately. Everyone else's plates were detailed, colorful, thoughtfully arranged. Their drinks sparkled in crystal glasses. Conversation flowed between passengers like warm water. And here she sat, with the equivalent of a child's brown bag lunch disguised as airline cuisine. She reached for the sandwich with hands that had begun to tremble, not from hunger, but from the sting of being so clearly othered. Across the aisle, the woman with the beige travel-wear leaned toward her husband again, whispering. The man glanced once at Ava's tray, raised an eyebrow, and then returned to his roasted duck and saffron rice. Ava chewed slowly, methodically, not for nourishment, but because it gave her something to do, something to focus on besides the fact that her presence in this space was treated like a misprint on a page, something to be skimmed over or corrected. Midway through the meal, Marla passed by again, this time carrying a bottle of sparkling elderflower water and offering it generously to passengers, pouring it into crystal stemware with grace. When she reached Ava's row, she poured a glass for 2B, then placed the bottle back into the linen-lined basket before Ava could even ask. Her thirst, apparently, didn't merit hydration. A few moments later, she returned, offering small chocolate truffles on a silver dish, the kind that melted slowly and hinted at luxury. Ava watched her serve one to nearly every passenger in the cabin. When Marla reached Ava's row, she paused, tilted her head as if in deep consideration, then said to the man beside her, "Would you care for an extra for the young man next to you?" The phrasing stung. Ava wasn't a boy. Marla knew this. There was no mistake, just another tiny jab, another way to diminish her, to twist her identity into something incorrect, unrecognized, and therefore unworthy. 2B declined politely, not bothering to glance at Ava, and Marla simply moved on. Time passed slowly. The tray remained in front of her long after the others had been cleared. When the attendant finally returned, she reached over Ava without a word, removed the foil tray like it was trash, and didn't offer anything further. No dessert, no napkin, not even eye contact. Ava sat back, hunger dulled but not gone, shame sharp and vivid. Her stomach wasn't the problem anymore. She had managed not to cry, not to speak, not to react, but inside, she was cracking. The silence surrounding her wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. The hum of the aircraft felt like static inside her head, amplifying her awareness of every interaction happening around her. The soft clinks of dishes being cleared, the occasional laugh between seatmates, the whispers of attendants attending to passengers who were never her. She felt like a ghost occupying a seat meant for someone else, someone who looked different, someone who wouldn't be silently erased. Then came the clipboard again. The sound of Marla Cray's polished shoes stopped next to her seat, and when Ava dared to open one eye, she saw Marla scribbling something on a small pad attached to the board, her expression neutral, her posture confident. Without a word, Marla moved past her and continued down the aisle. A moment later, she returned and paused once more. "Miss Rhett," she said quietly, bending slightly so her voice wouldn't carry, though her tone was sharp and cold. "May I ask you to accompany me to the galley for a moment?" Ava blinked. Her voice caught in her throat. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "It's a procedural matter," Marla replied. "Come with me." There was no choice in her tone, only command. Ava slowly unbuckled her seatbelt, her hands shaking slightly, and stood. Every pair of nearby eyes lifted just slightly. No one stared, but everyone noticed. The walk to the galley was short, but it felt endless. The curtain swished closed behind them, sealing Ava in with Marla and another attendant she hadn't seen before, a tall man with a shaved head and arms crossed in front of him. He stood silently near the back wall, expression unreadable. Marla gestured toward a small jump seat, and Ava sat down hesitantly. "You've been observed using unauthorized recording equipment," Marla said, pulling a printed form from a drawer. "Our policy strictly prohibits filming within premium cabins." Ava's eyes widened. I haven't filmed anything," she said, her voice thin. "I didn't even take my phone out." Marla's eyes narrowed. "Another passenger reported you pointing your device at them. Regardless of intent, we're required to document the event." She placed a form on a tray and handed Ava a pen. "This is just an acknowledgement. It won't affect your record if there's no further issue." Ava stared at the paper. It was an internal misconduct form with airline branding, already filled out in parts. Her name, the date, seat number, a vague summary of potential disruptive behavior. Her hands remained at her sides. "I didn't do anything," she whispered. "I swear." Marla folded her arms. "This is not an accusation. It's a standard form. You'll just sign here, and then you may return to your seat." Ava's gaze darted between the form, the silent man in the corner, and Marla's unflinching expression. She felt trapped. If she signed, she'd be admitting guilt. If she refused, she didn't know what they might do. Her breath quickened. "I don't want to sign something that isn't true," she said softly. "I didn't do anything wrong." Marla exhaled through her nose, picked up the pen, drew a large X across the signature line, then scrawled a note at the bottom. Passenger refused to cooperate. She flipped the form closed, snapped it into a folder, and gave Ava a curt nod. "You may return to your seat." The walk back felt heavier than before. She could feel eyes following her again, and though no one asked her what happened, their glances spoke volumes. She sat down, buckled in, and tried to slow her breathing. No one came to check on her. No one said a word. The man in 2B now angled himself even further away, a thin barrier of avoidance between them that hadn't been there before. Wordless judgment. Manufactured guilt. She wasn't just being excluded now. She was being documented, flagged, marked as a problem. And for what? For existing? For sitting where she was supposed to sit? A fresh wave of helplessness washed over her. Not long after, an announcement came through the cabin speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be dimming the lights in preparation for the next segment of our journey. If you require additional lighting, please use the overhead switch." As the cabin darkened again, the glow of personal screens illuminated the passengers' faces like flickers of judgment in the dark. Ava curled slightly into herself, arms folded, her spine pressing against the back of the seat as if she could melt into it. She wasn't crying, not yet, but her throat hurt from holding it in. Her chest ached. Another form of punishment arrived under the guise of protocol. A female flight attendant, not Marla, passed through the cabin with a set of blue wristbands, the kind used to indicate dietary restrictions or medical alerts. She paused at Ava's seat and placed a wristband on the tray table. "For monitoring," she said, then moved on. The band was blank. No label, no color code. Just blue. Ava didn't put it on. She didn't touch it. But now passengers had one more visual marker to question. Why did she get that? What did it mean? More eyes. More whispers. Another layer of quiet othering. When the mid-flight check occurred, Marla returned once again, clipboard in hand, pretending to assess seatbelt status and comfort levels. She leaned toward the man in 2B and asked with a honeyed tone, "Is everything to your satisfaction, sir?" He nodded. Then she turned to Ava, paused, and said nothing. She simply looked at her, looked at the blank wristband still on the tray, then walked away. The message was clear. She'd been evaluated, and she'd failed. Her tray table was up, her blanket untouched, and her eyes locked on the dark pane of glass to her right, where the world outside had turned pitch black, endless, and unknowable. Her own reflection stared back at her faintly, and in it, she saw a girl being pushed to the edges of visibility, not through screaming or violence, but through something much colder, systemic indifference wrapped in polite cruelty. The cabin lights remained dimmed, but the energy had shifted once again. First class felt like a curated bubble of comfort and exclusivity, and Ava had been recast as a blemish, an inconvenience quietly tolerated but never acknowledged. She could hear the whispers again, low and measured, barely audible, but undeniably about her. The couple across the aisle, the ones who had glanced at her during boarding, the woman with the beige scarf and the man with the graying temples, were speaking in controlled tones, their words meant to remain private but delivered with just enough volume to be overheard. The woman said something about entitlement these days, and the man responded with, "I miss when airlines had stricter standards." The statements weren't directed at her, by name, but Ava knew. They all knew. Ava adjusted the blanket on her lap, as if a small movement might distract her from the chill of social isolation, now coating her like frost. Her hands remained tucked beneath the fabric, fingers curled tight into her palms, not out of defiance but desperation. The only act of control left her. She had been monitored, falsely accused, given a meaningless wristband, and quietly labeled a disruptive presence, and yet she had said nothing. She had raised no voice, made no demand, issued no complaint. Still, the environment had begun to contract around her, the social oxygen dwindling with every minute. Another flight attendant, not Marla, but a young man with dark-rimmed glasses, walked down the aisle distributing small comfort kits. The navy blue pouches bore the airline's logo in gold embroidery and contained silk eye masks, lip balm, socks, and lavender-scented wipes. Everyone received one. Everyone except Ava. When the attendant reached her row, he paused, scanned his list on the tablet, then looked at her with a puzzled expression. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice not unkind but distant. "You're not on the distribution list." Before she could ask why, he moved on. She turned her head slightly, enough to see that the woman across the aisle had received not one but two pouches, one resting in her lap, the other placed carefully into her tote. Ava stared at her own empty tray table. Every interaction was now designed to reinforce the idea that she didn't qualify, that she hadn't earned this seat, that her presence wasn't just unexpected, it was inappropriate. Time stretched endlessly. Flight attendants passed her by again and again, each time bypassing her with smooth professionalism, never openly rude, never directly hostile, but always with that precise, intentional indifference that hurts far more than open rejection. She could feel it in the way they adjusted the air vent above another passenger, fluffed a pillow for someone across the aisle, crouched to tie a loose shoelace for an elderly man 3 rows up, every act a symbol of care and comfort, acts that were not for her. When Ava reached down into her backpack to retrieve a small notebook, something to focus her mind, she noticed that her bag had been slightly repositioned, pushed to the edge of the seat in front of her, as if nudged aside to create distance. It had been centered when she placed it there, carefully aligned and zipped. Now its angle and position suggested someone had moved it. The implication lingered. Her space had been encroached upon, but not violated enough to justify a complaint. Just enough to remind her that she was not truly welcome. Later, when snacks were distributed, small boxes of artisanal treats wrapped in gold foil, Ava watched as the cart came her way. She waited. She tried to believe this time would be different. But as the cart reached her row, the attendant looked directly at her, then glanced at a checklist and said, "Apologies, we're out." Seconds later, he offered 2 boxes to the passengers behind her. Ava turned away, her heart sinking lower. She hadn't asked for much, just not to be excluded from what was rightfully hers. As if in response to her growing numbness, a small boy's voice floated forward from the cabin behind the curtain. "Mama, look at the clouds." Ava turned slightly and saw the curtain part just a fraction, revealing a curly-haired boy from economy craning his neck to see out a window. A flight attendant gently guided him back, laughing. "Careful, sweetheart. First class is resting now." No reprimand, no clipboard, no warning, just warmth. Ava exhaled slowly. She had remained still, silent, careful. And still, she had been treated as a threat. That boy, full of life and energy, had trespassed unintentionally and was met with kindness. The message was clear. The rules weren't consistent. They were selective. They bent for some, tightened for others. As the cabin lights flickered back on slightly to simulate dusk, Marla passed Ava's row one final time during that segment. She paused just long enough to tuck a fresh napkin beneath the drink of the man in 2B. She didn't look at Ava. She didn't speak. But she reached into the pocket of her apron and placed a small sticker on the edge of Ava's tray. A circle bright yellow, printed with the number 32. No explanation, no context, just the sticker. When Ava looked down at it, her stomach twisted. It felt like a tag, a code, a mark, another unspoken message sent without confrontation. As another flight attendant rolled a card through the aisle, Ava felt a flicker of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this time she would not be left behind. But when the attendant reached a row, she only had a single set of standard headphones, old and worn, with a tangled cord frayed near the jack. She lifted one up, and the thin plastic housing cracked under the light pressure. Ava winced but took them anyway, knowing resistance was futile. Other passengers were handed sleek, new noise-canceling headphones, wrapped in plastic and pristine, with batteries fully charged and ready for the long flight ahead. The woman beside Ava accepted hers with a smile and slipped them over her ears, already immersed in music or a movie. Ava held the broken headphones in her lap, the sound through the damaged speaker faint and scratchy, a reminder that even the small comforts she was entitled to were being withheld. She reached out her hand slightly, hesitating, then gave a polite nod toward the attendant. "Is it possible to get a replacement?" Her voice was soft, careful, almost apologetic. The attendant glanced at the worn pair, then back to Ava, and shook her head gently. "I'm sorry, supplies are limited," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Priority goes to loyalty program members." Ava blinked, swallowing the lump forming in her throat. She forced herself to sit back, not wanting to seem ungrateful, but the sting was sharp. Not for the headphones themselves. It was the message behind the refusal. The clear hierarchy drawn not just by ticket class, but by social code, by invisible ranks that Ava had not been informed of, but that governed every interaction here. The flight continued in this manner. Drinks were offered with attentive smiles, blankets fluffed and placed delicately on laps, and menus checked and rechecked. Ava watched as the attendant came by to adjust a passenger's pillow 2 rows ahead, tucking it perfectly to provide comfort. She saw the precise placement of a fresh napkin on a passenger's tray table and the gentle wiping of a chin after a sip of wine. None of these small acts extended to her. When she pressed the call button this time, her request was met with a brief glance, a hesitation, then a polite but firm, "I'll be right there," that never translated into action. Minutes ticked by. No one came. Her throat grew dry, her mouth parched from the recycled air of the cabin. She wanted water, but felt the weight of the cabin's unspoken rules press down on her. Asking again might provoke annoyance or further exclusion. She stared at the silver call button on her armrest, as though it were a riddle she could not solve. At last, a different attendant appeared, a woman with kind eyes and soft hands, who paused beside her and asked quietly, "Are you okay?" Ava nodded, unable to speak through the tightness in her chest. The attendant hesitated, glanced around, then leaned in and whispered, "I'll bring you some water." Ava's heart lifted, but when the glass came, it was half full, warm, and delivered silently with no further attention. She took a sip slowly, savoring it despite the poor quality. Elsewhere in the cabin, the contrast was glaring. The passenger in seat 2B had a full selection of wines and fresh fruit plates, accompanied by fresh bread rolls and butter churned from the finest cream. The woman across the aisle had been offered a selection of cheeses and desserts, accompanied by an attentive flight attendant who refilled her glass without being asked. Ava's eyes flicked to her own tray, still empty except for the cracked headphones and the yellow sticker marking her as an anomaly. She swallowed hard, fighting tears that threatened to betray her. She clenched her fists beneath the blanket, trying to anchor herself, to hold on to whatever dignity remained. Ava's stomach grumbled faintly, reminding her she hadn't eaten in hours. She thought about the granola bar tucked away in her backpack, but hesitated. To eat in this state felt like admitting defeat, like giving in to the silence and the exclusion. Instead, she sat still, imagining herself shrinking smaller, blending into the dark window beside her. The world outside was an endless expanse of black, and inside, she felt trapped in a bubble of isolation. Marla Cray appeared once more, moving through the cabin with the authority of a queen surveying her court. She stopped just long enough at Ava's row to adjust the angle of the headrest, but not to speak or offer anything. The touch was clinical, almost dismissive, as if to remind Ava of her place, not as a valued passenger, but as an irritant barely tolerated. Then Marla's eyes met Ava's for a fleeting moment, cold and unreadable. No apology, no recognition, no empathy. Just a glance that said everything without words. You are not welcome here. Ava tried to disappear into her seat, to become invisible to the world around her. But the constant barrage of subtle, calculated slights chipped away at her. Every denied request, every ignored call, every deliberate omission reinforced the message she had been given since stepping aboard, that she was not worthy of the service promised to those around her. The plane was a world of comfort and luxury for everyone else, a floating sanctuary of warmth, hospitality, and ease. For Ava Lynn, it was a chamber of silent judgment and isolation, where kindness was rationed and dignity was in short supply. The other passengers seemed oblivious to her suffering, absorbed in their movies, conversations, and cocktails, protected by layers of privilege and the unquestioned comfort of belonging. But the veil of normalcy was about to lift in a way no one could have predicted. As Ava leaned back slightly, trying to steady her breathing and stave off the fatigue pooling in her muscles, the cabin door near the cockpit suddenly opened with a soft hiss. A tall figure entered, moving with deliberate grace that commanded attention without a word. The man was older, late 50s perhaps, dressed impeccably in a dark suit that bore a subtle but unmistakable crest embroidered on the lapel. His silver hair was neatly combed, his expression unreadable but stern. Passengers who noticed him turned their heads. Even Marla Cray, who had maintained an icy reserve all flight, paused mid-step and cast a flicker of unease toward the newcomer. The man's eyes scanned the cabin with quiet authority, briefly meeting Ava Lynn's gaze. She did not flinch, despite the pounding in her chest, the sharp prick of nerves, and the hollow ache of hope that this stranger might be the answer to her silent prayers. Without hesitation, the man approached her seat and paused just inches away. From inside his jacket, he produced a small rectangular object, a badge polished and embossed with the airline's emblem, but unlike any standard crew ID. The badge glowed faintly in the low light, etched with intricate lettering that spelled out, Board Observer Level Alpha. He held the badge out, palms up, and in a gesture that seemed both formal and deeply personal, he carefully extended it toward Ava Lynn. The moment was charged with an unspoken significance, a silent acknowledgement of her place, not just as a passenger, but as someone connected to the highest levels of the airline's leadership. Ava reached out, fingers trembling, and took the badge into her hands. She turned it over slowly, the weight of the metal cool against her skin, the inscription confirming what no one aboard had yet realized. Ava Lynn Rhett was more than just a passenger. She was the daughter and heir to the company that operated this very flight. A hushed murmur began to ripple through the cabin as other passengers noticed the exchange. The woman with the beige scarf gasped quietly, clutching her partner's arm. The man beside Ava Lynn shifted in his seat, eyes wide with surprise and perhaps a flicker of guilt. Even Marla Cray's composed facade faltered for a split second, her lips parting slightly as if to say something, before she caught herself and quickly averted her gaze. The man with the badge nodded once, a gesture of affirmation and respect, then retreated toward the cockpit without another word. The door slid shut behind him with a final hiss, leaving an eerie silence in his wake. For several long seconds, the cabin was frozen in place. Then phones were quietly pulled out. Cameras were discreetly raised. Whispered conversations escalated in volume as the reality of the moment sank in. Ava Lynn's identity was no longer a secret. The carefully constructed veneer of exclusion and denial that had shaped her flight was cracking, exposing the raw truth beneath. She was not just another passenger. She was the airline's future, and those who had mistreated her had done so in ignorance of the power she wielded. Ava felt the shift in atmosphere immediately. The weight on her chest lifted just a fraction, replaced by a surge of something else. Strength, vindication, the quiet fire of justice beginning to ignite. She touched the badge gently, almost reverently, and looked around at the faces now turned toward her with varying degrees of astonishment, shame, and curiosity. Some avoided her eyes, as if suddenly aware of the gravity of their earlier judgments. Others whispered fervently, racing to connect the dots of the day's unspoken truths. Marla Cray remained frozen in place near the rear of the cabin, her usual confidence replaced by a flicker of panic. The woman who had wielded her authority so cruelly now faced the undeniable power of the woman she had tried to erase. For the first time, the unspoken hierarchy was reversed. The passenger who had been marginalized was, in fact, the heir to the entire operation. The woman who had been the target of silent hostility now stood at the center of attention, unyielding, dignified, and undeniable. The steward assigned to Ava's row stepped forward hesitantly, carrying a small black box. Without a word, he opened it to reveal a finely crafted lapel pin, the symbol of executive membership within the company. He extended it toward Ava, who took it with a small nod, her fingers steady now, her eyes shining with resolve. The gesture was both an apology and a declaration. The rules had changed. The game had shifted. Around the cabin, passengers began to shift in their seats, casting nervous glances at one another as the reality settled in. The previously hushed whispers now carried tones of admiration, incredulity, and the dawning awareness that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The quiet but profound moment when power was revealed not through words or violence, but through a silent gesture of recognition. Ava Lynn sat back, her breath steady, her posture regal despite the exhaustion etched in her features. The badge and pin gleamed in the soft light, symbols not only of status, but of resilience. She had endured hours of calculated exclusion, humiliation, and isolation, and now her identity was unveiled in the most elegant way imaginable, not with a shout, but with a quiet, undeniable truth that no one aboard could ignore. Behind her, the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the cabin remained firmly closed, but now it felt like a barrier between two very different worlds, one of privilege and unquestioned authority, and one where invisible walls had been erected to exclude and diminish. The unexpected arrival of the senior executive and the quiet transfer of symbols from his hands to Ava's had sparked something profound, a reordering of power that was about to ripple through every level of the flight crew, starting with Marla Cray, the woman who had so carefully engineered Ava's exclusion. Within moments, the tranquility of the flight was disrupted by the sharp buzz of a radio from the back of the cabin. A steward, previously invisible in the dim light, turned swiftly and pressed a button on a handheld device. The crackling response came instantly, urgent and clipped. "Cabin crew, this is the flight manager. We have a situation requiring immediate executive intervention." The words carried weight, and the crew's demeanor shifted instantly. Marla Cray's stride faltered. She paused, casting a glance toward the cockpit door, then back at Ava, whose calm composure remained unshaken despite the undercurrent of tension building around her. The cabin staff quickly gathered near the galley, their movements precise and professional, but with an undercurrent of nervous energy that hadn't been present earlier. A few minutes later, the chief purser appeared, her face stern but composed. She stepped toward the microphone mounted near the forward cabin and addressed the passengers with clear authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are implementing operational changes at the direction of senior management aboard this flight. Certain crew members will be relieved of their duties for the remainder of the journey to ensure our commitment to the highest standards of service and respect for all passengers." The announcement was vague, but the meaning was unmistakable to those who had been watching the situation unfold. The word operational changes masked a direct response to the events surrounding Evelyn Rhett and the treatment she had received. Back at the rear of the cabin, Marla was approached by a tall man in a dark suit, a figure who exuded authority and command. The two exchanged a brief but intense conversation, hushed enough to remain private yet charged with the weight of impending consequences. Marla's posture stiffened, and her usual confident mask cracked, revealing a flicker of apprehension. The man produced a document from his briefcase, handed it to her with a look that brooked no argument. Marla read the paper, her eyes widening slightly before she nodded reluctantly. Within moments, another steward stepped forward to address the cabin. Effective immediately, Marla Cray and several other crew members will be replaced for the remainder of this flight. New personnel will assume their roles shortly. Passengers exchanged glances, murmurs spreading like wildfire as crew members quietly exited the first-class cabin, replaced by fresh faces, younger, more deferential, and noticeably less tense. The air seemed to breathe easier as the new attendants offered smiles and sincere apologies for any discomfort experienced earlier. Evelyn's gaze never wavered from the door through which Marla had exited. The woman who had spent hours undermining and isolating her was now physically removed, a tangible shift that symbolized more than just a change in staffing. The new steward assigned to Ava's row approached with an apologetic smile and set down a tray of refreshments, fresh fruit, a choice of premium beverages, and a warm blanket folded with care. "We're here to make sure you're comfortable for the rest of the flight," the steward said softly, handing her a glass of chilled water. Ava accepted without hesitation, a small but genuine smile touching her lips. It was a simple gesture, but one laden with meaning, an acknowledgement of dignity restored, however quietly. Across the cabin, passengers who had once averted their eyes now studied Ava with renewed respect, some offering polite nods or murmured congratulations. The woman with the beige scarf caught Ava's eye and hesitated before offering a tentative smile. Ava returned it with a grace that bespoke endurance and unspoken strength. The atmosphere had shifted dramatically, as if the very fabric of the flight had been rewoven in the wake of the revelation and the swift reaction from corporate leadership. Behind the scenes, the flight deck was a hive of quiet activity. The captain spoke urgently into the radio, coordinating with ground control and corporate headquarters, ensuring that the necessary protocols would be followed upon landing. The presence of the senior executive aboard was no mere coincidence. His intervention signaled the seriousness with which the airline took the incident. He moved among the crew with calm authority, setting the tone for the corrective measures underway. In the cabin, Evelyn reclined her seat slightly and looked out at the endless night sky. For the first time since boarding, she felt a sense of control return to her body. The ordeal was far from over, but the scales of justice were tipping, and she was no longer invisible. She fingered the badge and pin on her lapel, symbols of her rightful place and the silent power she carried. The world outside remained vast and unknowable, but inside the cabin, a new chapter was beginning, one where truth, respect, and dignity would no longer be quietly denied. The sleek aircraft, designed to cocoon its privileged occupants in luxury, was now the stage for a reckoning that few could have anticipated at boarding. As the plane touched down on the tarmac and began taxiing toward the gate, the undercurrent of excitement and tension intensified. The private spectacle of power, prejudice, and redemption was about to spill into the public eye. A black luxury SUV waited discreetly just beyond the jet bridge, its polished exterior reflecting the bright floodlights of the airport. As the door of the plane opened, a company representative clad in a sharp suit and wearing a discreet earpiece stepped aboard. He moved swiftly, carrying a slim leather portfolio that seemed more than just paperwork. It was a symbol of corporate urgency and intent. Passengers craned their necks, watching as he strode directly toward Evelyn, who remained seated, poised and composed despite the day's ordeal. Without a word, he extended a hand to her, escorting her quietly off the plane through a private access door normally reserved for crew and executives. The usual bustle of disembarking passengers was suspended for a moment, the contrast between Evelyn's dignified exit and the murmurs of onlookers palpable. Behind her, the cabin staff, including Marla Cray, now absent from the cabin, were left to confront the consequences of their actions. Ground security officers boarded, and airline officials began discreet interviews with passengers and crew, gathering statements about the events that had unfolded. The initial corporate silence was shattered as fragments of the incident began leaking to the media, first through social networks, then through traditional news outlets hungry for a story that combined privilege, prejudice, and justice. The viral videos captured by discreet passengers, the subtle slights, the yellow warning slip, the disciplinary summons, were compiled and circulated with a headline that captured global attention. Black girl shamed on flight, airline heiress revealed. As the news spread, social media exploded with reactions. Hashtags like #JusticeForAva and #FlightFromHell trended within hours. Influencers, activists, and ordinary users shared the story, highlighting the insidiousness of discrimination cloaked in politeness and protocol. People from around the world weighed in, some expressing outrage and demanding accountability, others sharing personal stories of similar experiences. Evelyn became more than a passenger. She became a symbol of silent suffering and resilient dignity. News outlets sought interviews with airline executives, probing the company's policies, diversity training programs, and internal culture. The pressure mounted quickly, transforming a single flight incident into a public debate about systemic bias in the aviation industry. Meanwhile, Evelyn stayed mostly silent, surrounded by legal and corporate teams ensuring her comfort and safety. She granted few interviews, choosing instead to focus on her studies and the weighty responsibilities of her family's legacy. Yet her presence was felt everywhere, a quiet force reminding the world that power often hid behind overlooked faces, and that the cost of ignoring injustice could no longer be contained behind closed doors. In the days following the flight, the airline issued a formal statement condemning the behavior of the staff involved and pledging a comprehensive review of training and policies. "We are committed to creating an environment of respect and inclusion," the statement read, but many in the public demanded more: tangible changes, firmer accountability, and reparations for those harmed. Evelyn's experience galvanized a wave of corporate introspection not just within the airline, but across the industry. Executives held emergency meetings. Human resources departments overhauled protocols, and customer service standards were re-evaluated. The story had struck a nerve, exposing uncomfortable truths and forcing an overdue reckoning. Back at the airport, Evelyn's arrival was met with a mix of support and curiosity. Advocates and allies greeted her with quiet smiles, while journalists hovered at a respectful distance, waiting for a statement that never came. Instead, Ava walked through the terminal with her head held high, her posture steady, embodying the grace and strength that had carried her through the flight and beyond. Her badge and lapel pin glimmered subtly beneath her jacket, silent emblems of a fight won through resilience rather than confrontation. Her family prepared to use the incident as a catalyst for change. Plans were set in motion to launch initiatives aimed at combating discrimination within the airline, supporting marginalized employees, and fostering a culture of empathy and understanding. The media attention was intense, but Evelyn remained grounded, her focus on the work ahead rather than the spectacle. In the weeks that followed, the story continued to evolve, inspiring conversations about race, privilege, and power in spaces designed to separate and exclude. Evelyn's ordeal became a case study in corporate accountability, a reminder that even the most polished facades could hide deep-seated biases that required active, intentional dismantling. The aftermath of the flight left an indelible mark on the airline industry, a stark reminder that beneath the polished veneer of luxury and service lay deeply embedded prejudices that could no longer be ignored. Evelyn Rhett's ordeal had transformed from a private humiliation into a public reckoning, forcing not only the airline but the entire aviation sector to confront uncomfortable truths. When the plane finally touched down and the cabin doors opened, Ava was escorted off not just as a passenger, but as a figure whose presence demanded attention and respect. The media frenzy that had swelled during the flight continued to build, and by the time she stepped into the terminal, her story had reached millions across the globe. Reporters, activists, and allies awaited her arrival, eager for a glimpse of the young woman whose dignity had been tested and whose quiet strength had become a beacon of hope. Despite the intense scrutiny, Ava remained composed, embodying grace and resilience. She declined to make a public statement immediately, choosing instead to focus on the work that lay ahead, the real battle beyond the headlines and hashtags. Inside the corporate offices of the airline, swift and decisive action unfolded. Marla Cray, the flight attendant whose cold exclusion and cruelty had sparked outrage, was terminated within hours. The airline issued a formal apology, acknowledging the failure of its staff to uphold the values of respect and equality. The company's CEO appeared in a live broadcast, promising comprehensive reforms, including mandatory anti-discrimination training for all employees, revised customer service protocols, and the establishment of an independent oversight committee to ensure accountability. The airline also announced the launch of a new initiative named the Ava Project, dedicated to promoting diversity, inclusion, and equity within its ranks and across the industry. Evelyn herself took an active role in shaping this project, leveraging her position to create meaningful change. She worked closely with executives and advocates to develop programs that would provide education, mentorship, and resources to employees from marginalized communities, aiming to dismantle systemic barriers that had long gone unchallenged. Her efforts extended beyond corporate walls, inspiring dialogue and action in boardrooms, classrooms, and communities worldwide. The ripple effect of her courage and the airline's response sparked movement, encouraging other industries to examine their own practices and embrace change. In the months that followed, the airline's reputation transformed. What had once been a story of discrimination and exclusion evolved into a narrative of redemption and progress. Passenger satisfaction increased as the company demonstrated genuine commitment to equity, and employee morale improved with the implementation of fairer policies and open channels for reporting misconduct. The scandal had been a catalyst for growth and reflection, proving that even the most entrenched institutions could evolve when confronted with truth and accountability. For Evelyn, the journey was far from over. The scars of her experience remained, reminders of the pain endured and the resilience forged. But she carried those marks with pride, symbols of a battle fought not just for herself, but for countless others who had suffered in silence. She became an advocate, a mentor, and a leader, using her voice to champion justice and equality. The emblem of Level Alpha she wore was no longer just a badge of corporate rank. It was a testament to the power of perseverance and the imperative of standing against injustice. Her story resonated globally, reminding people that change begins with courage, that silence in the face of discrimination is complicity, and that true luxury is found not in exclusivity, but in inclusion. As she looked toward the future, Evelyn Redd envisioned an industry and a world where no one would be judged by the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth, but celebrated for their humanity and contributions. The flight that had started with exclusion ended in transformation, a powerful message etched into the very fabric of the airline and beyond. Justice, dignity, and respect are not privileges for the few, but rights for all. In that message lay hope, a call to action, and a promise that the sky could be a place not only of flight, but of equality. The end. If you found this story compelling, please like and subscribe for more powerful narratives like this. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the plot, what surprised you the most, or what you'd like to see explored further. Also, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. It's always amazing to connect with readers around the world. Your support means a lot and helps us bring more stories that matter to you.